October 1945. A muddy field in New York. The rain falls cold and steady. 847 German women step off cattle cars. Their legs shake. Their stomachs are empty. Their hearts pound with terror. For weeks they had heard the warnings. American soldiers would strip them naked, throw them into pits, leave them to die like animals. The propaganda had been clear. The Americans were monsters. Now, standing in the mud, they see it with their own eyes. Rows of wire cages stretching across the field. Each cage barely 6 feet wide. No roof, no shelter, just cold metal and barbed wire. One woman falls to her knees, another begins to pray. A young girl named Margaret whispers to herself, "This is where we die." But then something strange happens. An American soldier walks toward the first cage. He unlocks the gate. The women hold their breath, waiting for the beating, waiting for the gunshot. Instead, he speaks 2 words that make no sense. Welcome home. What followed was not death. It was not torture. It was something these women never expected, and it would shatter everything they believed about their enemy, their country, and themselves. What happened inside those cages? Why did grown women weep over a bar of soap? And what truth did they carry home that they could never speak aloud? This story will challenge everything you think you know about prisoners, enemies, and mercy. Before we begin, if you love stories that reveal the hidden side of history, please hit that subscribe button right now. It helps this channel survive and bring you more untold stories like this one. Tap the like button to show your support, and stay until the end, because the final truth Margaret discovered will stay with you long after this video ends. Now let us go back to that muddy field in New York. October 1945. The cages are waiting. The train had been moving for 3 days. Inside the boxcars, 847 German women sat pressed together like sardines. Their knees touched their chests. The air was thick with sweat, fear, and the smell of rusted metal. There was no room to stretch, no room to breathe properly, just bodies packed tight in darkness. These women were not soldiers. They were the remnants of Germany's women's labor service. Some had worked as radio operators. Others had packed bullets in munitions factories. A few had been nurses in field hospitals. Some had typed letters in military offices, letters they never questioned until their world collapsed. Germany had fallen 6 months earlier. Now these women were prisoners of war. Their destination remained a secret. No one told them where they were going. Rumors spread in whispered German. Some believed they would be sent to labor camps in the American Midwest. They imagined working in factories until their bodies broke. Others whispered darker fears. Perhaps they would be traded to the Soviets, sent to freeze in Siberia, never seen again. A young woman named Margaret sat near the front. She had turned 21 in a bomb shelter in Bremen. Now she believed something worse. She thought they were being taken somewhere to be forgotten, somewhere no one would ever look for them. The train finally stopped. The screech of brakes echoed through the cars, but the doors did not open. For 10 long minutes, maybe 15, the women sat in total darkness. They listened to sounds outside, boots crunching on gravel, orders barked in English, truck engines rumbling. Then the doors slid open with a metallic groan. Daylight stabbed into the boxcar like a knife. The women squinted and shielded their eyes. Slowly, they began to see shapes. Guard towers, fences topped with barbed wire. And beyond that, rows upon rows of wire cages. Each cage measured roughly 6 feet by 6 feet. Open to the sky, no roof, no shelter from rain or cold. A young American soldier appeared at the door. His rifle hung over his shoulder. His face showed no emotion. He waved impatiently. "Out! Come on, out!" His voice was not cruel. It was simply empty. Somehow that felt worse. The women began to climb down. Their legs were stiff from days of sitting. Their boots sank into thick mud. Margaret was near the front. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she looked around. The camp was massive. Barbed wire divided it into sections. Guard towers stood at every corner. Soldiers watched from above, their rifles catching the weak October sun. And everywhere, those cages, hundreds of them. Some stood empty. Others already held German prisoners, mostly men. They sat with their backs against the wire, staring at nothing. A woman behind Margaret started crying. Quiet, broken sobs. Another whispered a prayer in German. Her voice trailed off before she could finish. They had been warned about this. In the final days of the war, German officers had gathered the women. They told them what Americans did to prisoners. The Americans were savages, they said. They did not follow the rules of war. They would strip prisoners naked, throw them into pits, and leave them to die. Margaret had not believed all of it, but standing here now, staring at wire cages stretching into the distance, she wondered if the warnings had been true. One woman whispered what many were thinking. "This is where we die." No one disagreed. An American officer approached. He was older, maybe 40, with grey hair and a tired face. He carried a clipboard. His voice was flat and businesslike. "You will be processed in groups of 20. You will be assigned temporary holding areas. You will receive food and water. Follow all instructions." A translator repeated his words in German. The women listened with blank faces. Processed. Temporary holding areas. The language was cold. It offered no comfort. Then the gates of the first cage swung open, and 20 women were marched inside. But what happened next would confuse them more than any cage ever could. The first hour inside the cage was the worst. 20 women stood pressed together in a space meant for furniture, not human beings. Shoulders touched shoulders. Breath mixed with breath in the cold October air. There was no room to sit. The ground was bare mud, soaked from recent rain. Some women closed their eyes and prayed silently. Others stared through the wire at the camp beyond. A few younger women began to shake, their teeth chattering from fear, more than cold. Margaret watched the guards. They walked the perimeter with rifles slung over their shoulders. They talked to each other in English, sometimes laughing. When they glanced at the cages, their faces showed nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, just complete indifference. A young woman named Elsa stood next to Margaret. She had worked as a typist in Hamburg before bombs scattered her family. Now she looked ready to shatter into pieces. "They're going to leave us here to die," Elsa whispered. "This is how it ends." An older woman shot her a sharp look. "Quiet! Do not give them the satisfaction." But Elsa was right to be afraid. They were locked in cages like animals, like dogs waiting to be put down. Every woman felt it. 2 hours passed, then 3. The sun climbed higher, but the air stayed cold. Some women finally sat in the mud. Others leaned against the wire for support. Margaret refused to sit. Sitting felt like giving up. Then something changed. A truck rumbled into view and parked near the row of cages. American soldiers climbed out carrying large metal containers. 2 soldiers approached the first cage. One held a clipboard, the other unlocked the gate. The women inside tensed. They pressed themselves against the far wire, expecting the worst. But the soldier did not enter. Instead, he placed a large metal canteen just inside the gate. Next to it, he set a stack of tin cups. "Water," he said in broken German. "Wasser." The gate closed. The lock clicked. The soldiers moved to the next cage. When they reached Margaret's cage, she watched the soldiers' hands closely. They were steady, practiced. He set down the canteen and cups without looking at any of the women. His face remained blank. Then he was gone. For a long moment, nobody moved. Finally, an older woman stepped forward. She knelt in the mud and picked up the canteen. She poured water into a cup, sniffed it carefully, and took a tiny sip. She waited, as if testing for poison. Nothing happened. "It is water," she said. "Just water." The cups passed from hand to hand. Margaret drank carefully. The water was cold and tasteless, but clean. She had expected river water, something dirty and foul. This was not. This was pure. It made no sense. An hour later, the gates opened again. This time, the women were called out in groups of 5. Margaret's group was third. They were marched across the camp to a long wooden building with a red cross painted on the side. Inside, the air smelled of antiseptic and soap. American nurses in crisp white uniforms moved between tables. A translator with kind eyes explained what would happen. "You will be examined by a doctor. This is for your health. You will be checked for illness and injuries. Then you will receive clean clothing and be assigned to barracks." Barracks, not cages. Margaret felt something flicker inside her. Hope, relief. She pushed it down. It was too early to hope. The medical exam was quick. A doctor checked her eyes, throat and lungs. He asked questions through the translator. Had she been ill? Was she in pain? When had she last eaten properly? Margaret answered without emotion. The doctor made notes and nodded to the nurse. "She is healthy. Some malnutrition, but she will recover with proper food." Proper food. The words sounded absurd. Margaret had not eaten proper food in over a year. The next building was a shower facility. The women were led inside and fear returned like a cold hand around their throats. Showers. Everyone knew what that word meant. The camps in Poland. The gas chambers disguised as showers. Margaret's hands began to tremble, but the translator saw their faces and spoke quickly. This is only for washing. Hot water and soap, that is all, I promise you. They did not believe her, but they had no choice. They undressed and stepped forward. The water came on. Hot. Not lukewarm, not cold. Truly hot. And for the first time in months, Margaret felt clean. The smell hit Margaret before she saw the food. Meat. Bread. Something rich and savoury that made her stomach twist with hunger. She had not smelled food like this in years. Not since before the bombs started falling on Germany. After the showers, the women had been given clean clothes, simple cotton dresses, plain but soft. Margaret had dressed slowly, her fingers clumsy. The fabric felt strange against her skin. She had worn the same dirty uniform for weeks. Now they were led to a mess hall. Long wooden tables stretched across a large room. American soldiers stood behind a serving line, holding ladles and spoons. Steam rose from metal trays filled with food. Margaret took a tray and moved through the line. A soldier plopped mashed potatoes onto her plate. Another added a thick slice of meatloaf. A third poured brown gravy over everything. At the end, she was handed a piece of bread. White bread, soft and still warm. She stared at it. In Germany, bread had become hard and dark. Sometimes it contained sawdust to stretch the flour. This bread looked like something from a dream. Margaret sat at a table with women from her cage. For a long moment nobody ate. They simply stared at their plates. This was more food than Margaret had seen in a single meal in over a year, maybe longer. The meatloaf alone would have fed her family for 2 days back in Bremen. Elsa picked up her fork, then put it down. This cannot be real. The stern older woman took a bite of meatloaf. She chewed slowly, her face showing nothing. Then she swallowed and looked at the others. It is real. Eat. Margaret ate. The meatloaf was salty and rich. The potatoes were creamy. The gravy was thick and warm. She ate until her stomach hurt, but she could not stop. Around her, other women did the same. Some cried as they ate, tears running down their cheeks. Others ate in complete silence, their faces blank with shock. According to camp records, each prisoner received approximately 3,000 calories per day. This was more than many German civilians were eating at home. More than German soldiers had received in the final months of the war. Margaret set down her fork and looked around the mess hall. American soldiers sat at nearby tables, eating the same food. They laughed and talked, their voices loud and easy. They did not look like monsters. They looked like ordinary men, tired men far from home, eating dinner. She thought about the propaganda posters back in Germany. They had shown Americans as savage beasts with bloody teeth. They had called them barbarians who tortured prisoners for sport. But these men were eating meatloaf and joking with each other. Something cracked inside Margaret. A wall she had built to protect herself. It did not fall completely. Not yet. But it cracked. After the meal, they were taken to barracks. The building was long and low, divided into sections. Each section held 20 beds. Simple metal frames with thin mattresses. But there were sheets. Clean white sheets and wool blankets folded at the foot of each bed. Margaret stood beside her assigned bed and touched the blanket. Grey wool, standard military issue, but it felt like luxury. She had slept on bare floors and in bomb shelters for months. That night, lying in bed, Margaret could not sleep. The barracks were heated. Not warm exactly, but heated. She pulled the blanket up to her chin and stared at the ceiling. Outside, she could hear guards on patrol. Their boots crunched on gravel, but inside it was quiet. Safe. It made no sense. They were prisoners, enemies, yet they had been fed and cleaned and given beds. Margaret tried to match this with everything she had been told about Americans. The propaganda said they were brutal. The propaganda said they treated prisoners like dirt. But this was not brutal. This was almost kind. Almost. She closed her eyes and listened to the quiet breathing of the women around her. Tomorrow would bring more questions, more confusion. But tonight, for the first time in months, her stomach was full. And that simple fact terrified her more than any cage ever could. Morning came with the sound of a bell. 6 o'clock sharp. The women rose, slowly, still groggy and confused. They were given 15 minutes to wash and dress. Then they marched to the mess hall for breakfast. Margaret had expected thin porridge, maybe stale bread, and weak tea. Instead there were scrambled eggs, toast with butter, and coffee, real coffee, not the bitter acorn substitute they had drunk in Germany during the final years of the war. She wrapped her hands around the warm cup and breathed in the smell. It had been so long since she had tasted real coffee. She took a small sip and closed her eyes. The taste was rich and strong. It felt like waking up from a long nightmare. After breakfast, the women were assigned work duties. Margaret and 20 others were sent to the camp laundry. The work was simple, but tiring. Washing, drying, folding endless piles of uniforms and linens. The machines were loud, the air was hot and damp, but it was honest work. And at the end of the day, something unexpected happened. They were paid, not much, just a few cents in camp scrip, small tokens that could be used at the camp canteen. But it was payment, real payment for their labor. Margaret held the tokens in her hand, staring at them in disbelief. Prisoners were not supposed to be paid. Prisoners were supposed to work until they collapsed. That was what she had been taught. But here she was, holding wages earned with her own hands. The camp canteen opened every evening after dinner. It was a small building near the center of the camp. Margaret went on her third day, curious but cautious. The sight inside stopped her cold. Shelves lined with goods, chocolate bars in colorful wrappers, packs of Lucky Strike cigarettes, tubes of toothpaste, bars of soap, the same lavender-scented soap from the showers. It looked like a real store, a store in a prison camp. Elsa stood beside her, eyes wide. This is a trick. It has to be. But it was not a trick. Women were buying things, small things, a chocolate bar, a pack of cigarettes, a tube of toothpaste. Margaret bought a bar of soap and a pencil. She had no paper yet, but she wanted the pencil. She needed to write. She needed to record what was happening, because someday someone would need to know the truth. That night, she unwrapped a chocolate bar she had bought. She broke off a small square and placed it on her tongue. It melted slowly, rich and sweet. She had not tasted chocolate in 3 years. She closed her eyes and let the sweetness fill her mouth. For just a moment, she forgot she was a prisoner. The guards were a constant presence, but their behavior surprised her. Some were cold and professional, others were curious, even friendly. One guard stood out, a young corporal from Iowa named Miller. He often worked the laundry detail. He was quiet and polite. He spoke a little German, learned from his grandmother back home. One afternoon, as Margaret folded sheets, Miller approached. He held out a pack of chewing gum. "Want one?" Margaret stared at the gum, then at him. Was this a test? A trick? She shook her head. Miller shrugged and put the pack back in his pocket. "Suit yourself." He paused, then added, "You are doing good work. Keep it up." He walked away. Margaret stood frozen, confused. A guard had just complimented her work. A guard had offered her gum, not as a bribe, not as mockery, just as a simple human gesture. She did not know how to process it. Once a week, the camp held movie nights. A screen was set up in the mess hall. The films were American, usually comedies or musicals, bright and colorful, filled with singing and dancing. Margaret went to the first one out of curiosity. She did not understand most of the English dialogue, but the images were enough. Women in beautiful dresses, men in sharp suits. A world untouched by war. This was America. This was the enemy. And yet this was what they had. Music, color, joy. Germany had given her ashes. America was showing her songs. In November, the camp administration introduced a new program. They called it re-education. The prisoners whispered darker names for it. Propaganda, brainwashing. The women were required to attend classes twice a week. American officers gave lectures on democracy, freedom, and human rights. Margaret sat in the back, arms crossed, ready to dismiss everything as lies. Then came the lecture that changed everything. The topic was concentration camps. An American officer stood at the front of the room. Behind him, a white screen hung on the wall. His voice was flat and emotionless as he began speaking. "What you are about to see is real. These photographs were taken by Allied soldiers when they liberated the camps." The first image appeared on the screen. Piles of bodies, skeletal figures stacked like firewood, men, women, children. Their eyes hollow, their bones pushing through paper-thin skin. The room fell silent. More images followed: the ovens at Auschwitz, the gas chambers at Treblinka, mass graves filled with thousands of corpses, survivors who looked more dead than alive, staring into the camera with empty eyes. Margaret felt her stomach turn. She wanted to look away, but she could not. She had heard rumours during the war, whispers about camps in the east, about terrible things happening to Jews and others deemed undesirable by the Reich. But she had told herself they were exaggerations, enemy propaganda, lies designed to make Germany look evil. The photographs did not lie. Some women covered their mouths, others turned away, unable to look. A few wept openly, their shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Margaret stared at the screen, her mind racing. She had served the Reich. She had typed letters, filed reports, followed orders without question. She had been a small part of the machine that had produced these horrors. She had not known, but did that matter? She had been part of it. After the lecture, the women filed out in complete silence. No one spoke. What was there to say? That night, Margaret lay awake. The images burned into her mind like fire. She could not escape them. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the bodies, the bones, the empty stairs. The guilt was crushing. Late at night, when the barracks were dark, the women talked in whispers. The conversations had changed since they arrived. At first, they talked about home and family. Now they talked about something else entirely. One night, a woman named Hannah spoke what many had been thinking. We were lied to. The barracks fell silent. They told us the Americans were animals, Hannah continued, that they would torture us and starve us. But look at us. We are fed. We are warm. We are treated better here than we were in our own country. An older woman, a former nurse, spoke up. Do not forget what they did. The bombings, the destruction. They turned our cities to rubble. And we did the same to theirs, Hannah shot back. Or do you think the Luftwaffe did not bomb London? Did not kill civilians? Silence again, heavy and uncomfortable. Margaret lay still, listening. She did not join the conversation, but she felt its weight pressing on her chest. The questions Hannah raised were the same questions eating at Margaret's soul. If the enemy was so evil, why were they showing such humanity? If Germany was so righteous, why had it produced such horror? Not everyone wrestled with these doubts. Some women clung fiercely to their old beliefs. They insisted the photographs were fake. They said the treatment they received was a trick to weaken their loyalty. One woman refused to attend the lectures. She called them poison, designed to turn Germans against their homeland. Margaret understood. Loyalty was not easily abandoned. It was woven into identity. To question that loyalty meant questioning everything you believed about yourself. For some, that was too much to bear. But, for Margaret, the wall had cracked further. The photographs had torn something open inside her, and through that opening, doubt poured in like floodwater. She could not unsee what she had seen, and she could not unfeel what she now felt. In March 1946, the announcement came. The women would be sent back to Germany. The news spread through the camp like wildfire. Some women wept with joy, others fell silent, their faces pale with fear. Margaret felt nothing, no joy, no relief, just a strange, hollow emptiness. She should have been happy. She was going home, but home was ruins. Home was hunger. Home was a nation trying to rebuild from ashes. The night before departure, Corporal Miller found Margaret in the laundry. He handed her a small bag. For the journey, he said. Inside were chocolate bars, a pack of cigarettes, and a sealed envelope. Margaret opened the envelope. A short note was inside. You are a good person. I hope you find peace. Good luck. Miller. Margaret looked up, but Miller was already walking away. She wanted to call after him, to thank him, to say something meaningful, but the words would not come. She simply stood there, holding a world where survival was a daily battle. She rarely spoke about her time in the American camp. When people asked, she said only that she had been treated fairly. But the truth was more complicated. The truth was that the enemy had shown her a different way, a different set of values, and she could not forget. Decades passed, Germany rebuilt, Margaret married, had children, built a life, but she never forgot. The notebook Corporal Miller had given her remained in a drawer, filled with her observations, her questions, her slow transformation from prisoner to witness. One day, when her granddaughter was old enough to understand, Margaret took out the notebook and told her story. She told her about the cages, the terror, the soap, the food, the kindness, the photographs, the guilt. What did you learn? Her granddaughter asked. Margaret thought for a long moment. I learned that the world is more complicated than we are taught. I learned that enemies can show mercy, and I learned that kindness is the hardest thing to carry, because kindness forces you to see humanity in people you were taught to hate. And once you see that, you can never unsee it. The cages had been meant to hold them. But what they really did was break open everything these women thought they knew. And sometimes being broken is the only way to be made whole. In October 1945, 847 German women arrived at Camp Shanks expecting death. They found something far more dangerous than torture. They found mercy. The wire cage in the note, feeling the weight of kindness she did not understand. The ship docked in Hamburg in early April. The city was unrecognizable. Whole neighborhoods had been reduced to rubble. Buildings stood like broken teeth against a grey sky. People moved through the streets like ghosts, hollow-eyed, thin, dressed in rags. Margaret stepped off the ship and felt reality crash over her like a cold wave. This was home. This was what remained of everything she had known. She found her mother in a temporary shelter, a converted school building housing refugees and displaced persons. The conditions were terrible. Families crowded together in small spaces. The smell of unwashed bodies hung in the air. Her mother was thin, painfully thin. Her clothes hung loose on her frame. Her cheeks were sunken. Her eyes looked too large for her face. But she was alive. When she saw Margaret, she wept. They held each other for a long time, neither speaking. There were no words big enough for this moment. Finally, her mother pulled back and looked at her daughter. Her eyes travelled over Margaret's face, her body, her healthy complexion. "You look well," she said quietly. Half question, half accusation. Margaret nodded. "They fed us, treated us properly." Her mother's face twisted with something complicated. Anger, jealousy, relief, all mixed together. "We starved," she whispered. "While you were safe, we starved." The words cut deep, but they were true. Margaret had no defense. She had survived. She had been cared for, and her family had suffered. It was not fair, but it was the truth. Life in post-war Germany was brutal. Food was scarce. Work was impossible to find. Everything was broken. Buildings, roads, people. Margaret tried to adjust, but everything felt wrong. She had grown used to regular meals, to safety, to the strange kindness of her captors. Now she was back in a world that terrified them became symbols of shattered expectations. The soap, the hot showers, the meatloaf dinners, the chocolate bars, the small kindnesses of ordinary soldiers. These were not grand gestures, they were simple acts of humanity in a world that had forgotten what humanity meant. But for the women who received them, these acts were transformative. They forced a reckoning with everything they had believed, everything they had been taught. War divides the world into us and them. It demands that we see enemies as monsters. But what happens when the enemy refuses to be monstrous? What happens when they show mercy instead of cruelty? Margaret carried that question for the rest of her life. She never found a perfect answer, but she learned one truth that never left her. Cruelty hardens, but mercy changes you forever.